The sound was not a gunshot, but it was just as final. It was the sharp, percussive crack of the bank's plate glass window shattering an explosion of crystalline shards that sprayed across the dusty floorboards of Solitude Creek's First Territorial Bank. For a frozen moment, the world held its breath. The teller, a young man named Peterson, with a perpetually nervous Adam's apple, froze with his hand halfway into a cash drawer. The two ranchers waiting in line stared, their faces blank with disbelief. Marshal Jedediah Stone did not freeze. The sound, the sudden violence of it, was a language he understood better than most. He was turning even as the glass was still falling, his hand dropping by instinct to the cold, reassuring weight of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Through the jagged maw of the broken window vaulted a man dressed in black, a dusty bandana already pulled high over his nose. He was followed by two more, their movements fluid and practiced. Nobody move a muscle. The first man barked, his voice a low growl that cut through the sudden, shocked silence. His eyes, cold and dark above the cloth, swept the room. Jedediah stood by the counter, his worn gray coat unbuttoned. He had been making a small deposit, a mundane Tuesday ritual that had just been violently interrupted. He kept his hands visible away from his sidearm, his posture relaxed but coiled. He was outnumbered, outpositioned, and the two ranchers were caught in the crossfire. His mind, honed by years of war and law, became a machine of cold calculation. 3 men inside, at least one outside with the horses. Peterson is the weak link. Protect the civilians. The leader of the trio, a tall, wiry man with an air of predatory stillness, pointed a long-barreled Schofield revolver at Peterson's trembling face. The safe, son. Open it, and be quick about it. My patience is as thin as this winter's charity. The other 2 men herded the ranchers against the far wall, their movements efficient and brutal. Jedediah remained where he was, a silent, watchful presence. The leader's eyes flicked to him, taking in the star pinned to his coat, the steady, unblinking gaze. A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, or recognition, crossed his features. Well, look what we have here. The man drawled, his voice laced with a faint, cultured accent that was jarringly out of place. The law. Stand easy, Marshal. Today is not your day to die. Unless you make it so. Jedediah's mind raced. He could draw, likely take down the leader and one of the others before the third shot him. But the ranchers? A stray bullet, a moment of panic, and their blood would be on his hands. It was a ghost he knew too well. A tactical mistake from a lifetime ago that still haunted his nights. He would not make it again. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The money isn't worth anyone's life. Wise man, the leader said with a humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. He motioned with his gun, and one of his men began stuffing bags with the cash from Peterson's drawer while the other stood guard. The leader walked toward Jedediah, his boots scuffing on the glass-strewn floor. He stopped a foot away, the barrel of his Schofield never wavering. He was close enough now that Jedediah could see the fine lines around his eyes, the cruel set of his mouth. This was no common thug. There was an intelligence there, a cold, burning purpose. You're Marshal Jedediah Stone, the man said. It wasn't a question. I've heard of you. The quiet hero of the valley, a man who prefers the company of silence. He tilted his head. I wonder why that is. Jedediah said nothing, his gaze locked with the outlaws. The air crackled with unspoken tension. This was personal. But how he'd never seen this man before in his life. The outlaw's eyes dropped from Jedediah's face to the thin silver chain visible at the collar of his shirt. With a movement as quick as a striking snake, his free hand darted out and snagged it. He yanked hard. The chain snapped, and the small, oval silver locket that had rested against Jedediah's skin for 10 years came free. A white-hot rage, cold and pure, surged through Jedediah. It was a fury so profound It momentarily deafened him to the world. The locket had been his wife's. Sarah. He had placed it around her neck on their wedding day. After she was taken by the fever, it was all he had left of her. A cool, smooth weight against his heart, a tangible piece of a life that felt like a distant dream. The outlaw held it up, dangling it from his fingers. He flipped it open with his thumb. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a smiling young woman with kind eyes. A pretty thing, he murmured, his voice soft, yet carrying the sharp edge of a razor. Both of them. He snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his own pocket. "This isn't about the money, is it?" Jedediah's voice was low, a dangerous rumble. The man's eyes met his, and in their depths, Jedediah saw a bottomless well of hatred. "The money is a tool, Marshal. Everything is a tool. This," he patted the pocket where the locket now rested, "is a message." Behind them, Peterson swung open the heavy door of the vault. The other two men moved inside, their greed pulling their attention. It was the moment. The leader was distracted, his focus on Jedediah, but it was still too great a risk. The memory of cannon fire, of screams from a burning farmhouse, of a tactical decision that saved his men, but cost innocent lives, held his hand. Not again. Never again. "We're done here," the leader called out. His men emerged, their bags heavy. He backed away from Jedediah, his gun still trained on him. "You'll find my calling card out on the northern trail, Marshal. A gift just for you. Don't you disappoint me." And then they were gone, backing out through the shattered window, their movements a blur of practiced efficiency. The thunder of hooves echoed down the street, fading into the vast, cold silence of the plains. For a long moment, the bank was utterly still. The only sounds the ragged breathing of the two ranchers and Peterson's quiet, choked sobs. Jedediah stood unmoving, his hand unconsciously touching the hollow space on his chest where the locket had been. The rage was gone, replaced by an icy, unyielding resolve. This was more than a robbery. It was a declaration of war. A war aimed directly at him. And the man who called himself Silas Blackwood had just made the fatal mistake of taking the one thing Jedediah Stone could not live without. The trail was easy to follow, even with the threat of an approaching blizzard hanging heavy in the iron-gray sky. Blackwood's gang had ridden hard, but they were arrogant, leaving a clear path churned in the half-frozen mud of the northern plains. Jedediah rode Vulcan, his powerful roan, with a grim, single-minded focus. The cold was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at any exposed skin, its teeth sharp and relentless. It seeped into the marrow of his bones, a constant, unwelcome guest, but he barely noticed. The ice in his veins was colder still. Behind him, Solitude Creek was a town holding its breath. He had left his young deputy, Ben Miller, in charge. Ben was a good kid, barely 20, with earnest eyes and a desire to prove himself that sometimes outstripped his common sense. "You be careful, Marshal," Ben had said, his voice tight with concern. "They're professionals." "So am I," Jedediah had replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He had stopped only briefly at Hemlock's livery. The stable hand, a grizzled old man with hands as tough as cured leather, had been currying Vulcan. Hemlock had known Sarah. He'd seen the locket 100 times, heard what they took. Jed Hemlock had said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look at Jedediah, just kept working the brush over Vulcan's flank. Not just the town's money. Jedediah had only nodded, tightening the saddle cinch. The unspoken sympathy was more than he could bear. The locket was a piece of his soul, and its theft felt like a desecration of a sacred grave. Now, hours into the chase, the landscape unfolded in a monotonous panorama of white and gray. Skeletal aspens clawed at the sky, and the wind moaned a lonesome tune through the pines. This was the world he had chosen after the war, a vast, empty quiet he'd hoped would drown out the echoes of the past. The echoes of cannon fire, of orders given of the farmhouse near Shiloh. He had led a flanking maneuver that had turned the tide of a small but vicious battle. His men were saved, the enemy routed. But a stray artillery shell, one of his own, had struck the civilian farmhouse they were using for cover. He had seen the aftermath, the faces of the family, a man, a woman, 2 small children. And that sight had scoured his youth away, leaving behind a man who understood the terrible cost of duty. He had come west to escape that ghost, to build a life where his actions protected the innocent, not damned them. His focus sharpened as he crested a low rise. The tracks scattered here. The gang had split up, a classic tactic to confuse a posse. But Jedediah wasn't a posse. He was a singular, focused instrument of justice. He scanned the ground, his eyes trained by years of tracking man and beast, picking out the subtle signs. One set of tracks veered northwest, deeper into the desolate hill country. It was the heaviest horse shod, with a distinctive bar on the left forefoot. Blackwood's horse. He was riding alone, or with only one other. Arrogant. The wind was picking up now, carrying the first stinging needles of snow. The sky was darkening, the sun a pale, distant memory. He urged Vulcan on the big roan, snorting clouds of steam that froze almost instantly in the air. The silence of the plains was absolute, a profound emptiness that amplified the thud of his own heart. It was in this state of frozen monotony, his mind fixed on the image of Sarah's smile inside the stolen locket, that he saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape against the stark white of a snowdrift huddled at the base of a skeletal cottonwood. An anomaly in a world of white. His war-honed instincts screamed ambush. He reined Vulcan to a halt so sharply the horse tossed its head in protest. His hand dropped to the Colt, the leather of the holster worn smooth by years of habit. He scanned the silent, snow-laden trees, searching for any glint of steel, any puff of hidden breath. There was nothing. The world was utterly still, muffled by the thickening snow. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in these parts, won out over caution. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the powder. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. He approached the shape with the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking into a trap, his senses on fire. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a bundle of discarded rags or a dead animal. It was a person, a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, a desperate final attempt to conserve a life that was clearly fading. Her deerskin dress was torn and shredded. One shoulder was bare, the skin an alarming shade of blue-white. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was fanned out against the snow, laced with cruel crystals of ice. She was Apache. This wasn't just the work of the cold. The violent tears in her clothing and the raw, bruised skin visible beneath spoke of a brutal struggle. Someone had done this to her. They had broken her and left her for the winter to finish the job. Blackwood. It had to be. A gift just for you. The outlaw's words echoed in his mind. This was the calling card. A wave of cold fury washed over him. Crouching beside her, he pulled off a glove with his teeth and pressed 2 numb fingers against her neck. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Then he felt it, a pulse so faint, so thready, it was more a memory of a heartbeat than the real thing. She was alive. As he shifted her slightly to assess her injuries, his eyes caught a mark on her exposed shoulder. It wasn't a bruise. It was a brand, a deliberate scarred symbol burned into her flesh. His blood ran cold. He knew that symbol. It was a twisted, corrupted version of the insignia of his old Union regiment, the 17th Volunteers. A hawk wings spread, but with a serpent clutched in its talons. No one outside his old unit would know it, and no one inside it would ever desecrate it like this. This changed everything. The manhunt, once a mission to reclaim a piece of his past and uphold the law, was now something far deeper, far more personal. Blackwood knew who he was. He knew about the war. He had left this woman branded with a mockery of Jedediah's own history as a deliberate, calculated taunt. Saving her was no longer just a matter of duty. It was an act of defiance, a chance to atone for the ghosts of Shiloh. It was redemption, left beaten and freezing in the snow. Bringing an Apache woman to Solitude Creek was like carrying a lit torch into a powder keg. The raids last autumn, led by a renegade war band, were still fresh wounds, and the townsfolk, in their fear and anger, rarely bothered to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. To them, she would be a symbol of their fear, an enemy within the gates. He'd carried her back to town, slung over his saddle, wrapped in his own greatcoat, her shallow breaths a fragile rhythm against Vulcan's steady gait. He bypassed his own isolated cabin, knowing she needed more than he could provide. She needed a doctor. Dr. Albright was a man in his late 50s with weary eyes and hands stained with iodine and the accumulated knowledge of mending a town's worth of broken bones and broken spirits. He met Jedediah at the door of his small surgery, his face grim. Jedediah, what in God's name? He began, then stopped as he saw the woman in his arms. He ushered them inside without another word, his professional instincts overriding any prejudice. Jedediah laid her gently on the examination table. In the warm, lamplit room, the extent of her injuries was horrifyingly clear. Dark, ugly bruises marred her ribs and face. As Dr. Albright began to cut away the tattered remnants of her dress, the brand on her shoulder stood out like a curse. "I've seen brands on cattle, Jed," the doctor murmured, his voice tight with disgust. "Never on a human being." "It's a message," Jedediah said, his voice hard as granite. For me, news traveled fast in a town that small, and it didn't take long for the trouble to start. It began with a low murmur outside the doctor's office, a gathering of curious and fearful faces. Then the murmur grew into a growl. He recognized the voice of Ansel Garrison, a belligerent rancher whose wife and son had been killed in the autumn raids. Garrison was a man hollowed out by grief and filled back up with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Stone, we know who you've got in there." Garrison's voice was a raw bellow of rage. "You bring that Apache out. She's got no place in this town." A chorus of angry shouts echoed his demand. Jedediah looked at the doctor, who was cleaning the woman's wounds. "Lock the back door, Doc. Don't open it for anyone." He walked to the front door and stepped outside, closing it firmly behind him. He stood on the top step of the porch, a solitary figure against the growing mob. There were maybe 20 of them now, and their faces pale and furious in the fading light, their breath pluming in the cold. Some held lanterns, others held rifles. "Go home, Ansel," Jedediah said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through the noise. "There's nothing for you here." "The hell there isn't." Garrison spat, stepping forward. He was a big man, broad and powerful, but his rage made him clumsy. "You're harboring the enemy. My Mary and little Tom were killed by her kind. They deserve justice. This woman is a victim," Jedediah stated, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting every eye. "She was beaten and left to die by the same men who robbed our bank. The men I'm hunting. She is under my protection. That is the law." "We are the law tonight, Marshal," another man shouted from the back. A few men raised their rifles in agreement. Jedediah's hand didn't move toward his gun. Instead, he simply stood his ground, his presence as solid and unyielding as the mountains that watched over the valley. "The first man who tries to take another step onto this porch will be arrested for interfering with a federal marshal. The second man will be shot. Now I won't tell you again. Go home." His quiet certainty was more intimidating than any threat. He was not angry. He was absolute. The men in the crowd shuffled their feet, their bluster faltering under his unwavering stare. They were farmers and ranchers, not killers. But Garrison was beyond reason. "You're a traitor, Stone, choosing one of them over your own people," he roared, his face contorted with grief and fury. He took a step toward the porch. Jedediah's hand finally moved, but not for his gun. He simply unpinned the silver star from his coat and held it in his palm. This star means I protect everyone in this town. And tonight, that includes her. You want to get to her, you have to go through me, and through this badge. Are you willing to do that, Ansel? The finality in his voice hung in the frigid air. The mob hesitated, the fire of their collective rage turning to smoke. They looked at Garrison, then at the marshal. They saw a man who would not bend, who would not break, and who would die on that porch before he gave up his charge. One by one, they began to lower their rifles, their anger dissolving into sullen resentment. Garrison stood alone, his fists clenched, his body shaking with impotent fury. He glared at Jedediah, his eyes promising a reckoning. This isn't over, Stone. He turned and stormed away, the crowd melting back into the shadows behind him. Jedediah waited until the street was empty before turning and going back inside. He found Dr. Albright standing by the table, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. The woman was conscious now, her eyes open and fixed on the door. They were dark, deep-set eyes, and in their depths he saw not gratitude, but a profound, soul-deep weariness, and the same sharp, assessing fear he had seen in the eyes of a cornered wolf. She had just traded one enemy for a town full of them, and her only protector was a man she did not know, a man with ghosts of his own. The woman's name was Nia. She offered it 2 days later, her voice a dry, hoarse whisper, like autumn leaves skittering across stone. For those 2 days, Jedediah had remained in the doctor's small office, turning it into a makeshift fortress. He slept in a chair by her bed, the Colt resting on his lap. Dr. Albright brought them meals, his face a constant mask of weary concern. The town remained quiet, but it was a tense, simmering silence, the kind that precedes a storm. As Nia slowly recovered her strength, she began to talk. Her words were cautious and fragmented pieces of a story she was reluctant to tell. Jedediah never pushed, he simply listened, piecing together the narrative from the shards she offered. She and her small family had been traveling when Blackwood's gang descended on them. They were captured, her husband and brother killed. She was kept as a captive, a plaything for Blackwood's cruel amusement, until the blizzard threatened to slow them down. Then she was beaten, branded, and discarded. "He is not a common thief," she said one evening, her gaze fixed on the dancing flame of the kerosene lamp. "He does not steal. He conquers." She explained that Blackwood wasn't just a bank robber. He was systematically acquiring land. He targeted ranches on the verge of failure, using the money from his robberies to buy them out for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused were met with intimidation and violence. He was consolidating his power, building a small, lawless kingdom in the desolate valleys north of Solitude Creek. The bank, Jedediah realized the pieces clicking into place. The robbery wasn't just for the money. It was to bankrupt the town, to make sure no one could get a loan to survive the winter. He's forcing them to sell to him. He seeks the valley he calls Shadow Canyon. Nia whispered, and for the first time, a flicker of a different emotion crossed her face, a deep ancestral sorrow. "My people call it the Valley of Whispering Waters. It is a sacred place." Jedediah understood. A hidden water source. In this arid land, water was more valuable than gold. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything. While Jedediah was piecing together the larger strategy, Blackwood began to escalate his campaign of terror. A barn on the outskirts of town was burned to the ground one night, the rancher losing his entire winter hay supply. A few days later, a homesteader's well was poisoned, the water turning brackish and foul. Each incident was a message designed to stoke the town's fear and desperation, to turn up the pressure on them to sell, to flee. The attacks had the opposite effect on their feelings toward Jedediah. The townsfolk, led by the still furious Ansel Garrison, began to blame him. They saw Nia's presence as a magnet for the violence, a curse he had brought upon them. The respect they once held for their marshal was eroding, replaced by suspicion and open hostility. He was a man caught between two fires, the methodical evil of Silas Blackwood and the rising panic of the people he was sworn to protect. He knew he needed more information. He needed a prisoner. He began riding patrols again, not in a wide, sweeping pattern, but in tight, concentric circles around the town, hunting for any sign of Blackwood's men. He found it on the fourth day, a single rider checking traps. He was a young, nervous outlaw, no match for Jedediah's silent, swift approach. He brought the man back not to the town jail, which was little more than a wooden cage, but to the deep, stone-lined cellar beneath the doctor's office. He bound the man to a chair. Nia watched from the top of the stairs, her face an unreadable mask, as Jedediah began the interrogation. The outlaw, a man named Calloway, was arrogant, at first spitting insults. But Jedediah didn't use violence. He used silence. He sat across from the man in the dim, cold cellar and simply watched him, his gaze steady and patient. He let the quiet and the dark do the work for him. Hours passed. Calloway's bravado began to crack, replaced by a twitching nervousness. Finally, Jedediah spoke, his voice low and calm. "You're going to tell me about Blackwood. You're going to tell me everything." "Go to hell," Calloway muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've been there," Jedediah replied, and the simple, chilling sincerity of the statement seemed to break the man. "It's filled with men who followed orders without asking why. Men who died for someone else's cause. Is that what you want, Calloway, to die here in this cellar for Silas Blackwood?" Calloway began to tremble. "You don't know him. He's not who you think he is." "Then tell me," Jedediah pressed, leaning forward. "His name isn't Blackwood." The outlaw stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "It's Vance. Thomas Vance." The name meant nothing to Jedediah. He waited. "He talks about it sometimes when he's drunk." Calloway continued, the words spilling out in a desperate torrent. "Talks about the war, about a farm, about a battle near a place called Shiloh." Jedediah's blood turned to ice. Every muscle in his body went rigid. His wife, his children, they were killed, caught in the crossfire. An artillery shell from the Union side hit his house. Calloway was sobbing now. He says the officer who gave the order was a hero, that he got a medal for that day's work. He hates that man. He spent 15 years hunting him, learning everything about him. Jedediah felt the air leave his lungs. He could barely breathe. The cellars seemed to shrink around him, the stone walls pressing in. "The brand he put on the squaw," Calloway whispered, his voice barely audible. "It wasn't for her. It was a message. For the marshal of this town, a man named Stone." The world tilted on its axis. The bank robbery, the land grab, leaving Nia where he would find her, the locket, the brand. It was all an elaborate, monstrously personal act of revenge. Vance hadn't just stumbled upon him. He had orchestrated this entire nightmare. He didn't want Jedediah's life. Not yet. He wanted to strip him of everything he held dear. First, his honor, his town, his very soul. He wanted to make Jedediah watch it all burn, just as he had been forced to watch his own world turn to ash and smoke 15 years ago. The fight for Solitude Creek was no longer a matter of law and order. It was a tragic final confrontation with the ghosts of his past. Armed with the devastating truth, Jedediah knew he could no longer act alone. He had to make the town understand the true nature of the enemy at their gates. He called a meeting of the town council, a small group of business owners and ranchers who governed the fragile affairs of Solitude Creek. He left Nia in the care of Dr. Albright, her hand briefly clutching his as he left. "Be careful," she whispered. "He is a serpent." The meeting was held in the back room of Croft's Mercantile. The air was thick with the scent of pipe smoke and fear. Jedediah stood before them. Silas Croft, the pinched-faced merchant, Hemlock, the stable owner, and at the head of the table Ansel Garrison, who represented the ranchers. Jedediah laid it all out, his voice low and steady. He told them about Thomas Vance, about the revenge plot, about the systematic plan to ruin them and seize control of the valley and its water. He explained that every act of terror was designed to break their will. He's not just an outlaw. Jedediah concluded, his gaze sweeping their faces. He's a ghost. My ghost. And he will not stop until he has destroyed everything I am sworn to protect. That means all of you. For a moment there was a stunned silence. Croft looked pale, his mercantile suddenly feeling very flammable. Hemlock chewed on his unlit pipe, his brow furrowed. But Garrison laughed a harsh, ugly sound. A ghost story, he sneered. How convenient, Marshal. You bring an Apache into our town, and suddenly the violence gets worse. And now you spin this wild tale to cover your own incompetence. Or maybe your complicity. Ansel, that's enough, Hemlock growled. Is it? Garrison stood, his massive frame looming over the table. I've been talking to Mr. Blackwood's man. He came to me, offered me a fair price for my land, promised prosperity for this valley, a new dam irrigation. He says the only thing standing in the way of progress is a marshal who protects savages and a council too cowardly to act. The betrayal hit Jedediah like a physical blow. Garrison had made a deal with the devil. He's lying to you, Ansel, Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. He will take your land and give you nothing. He's given me more hope than you ever have, Garrison roared. While you were hiding in the doctor's office, I was making a plan for our future. He turned to the others. Blackwood's main camp is in Shadow Canyon. His men are getting a supply wagon tonight. He told me. He said if the town's law wanted to prove itself, they could try and stop it. Jedediah saw the trap instantly. Vance was using Garrison's grief and greed to lure him out. It's an ambush, Ansel. He's playing you. Or maybe he's testing me. Garrison retorted. Testing to see if I'm a man of action, unlike some I could name. He looked at Jedediah, his eyes full of smug triumph. I've already gathered the men. We ride in 1 hour. It was a disaster in the making. Jedediah knew he couldn't let them ride into a slaughter. He had to go with them to try and mitigate the damage, to turn the trap against the trapper. He grabbed his deputy Ben Miller, and they rode out to meet Garrison's haphazard posse. The raid was a catastrophe. They found the supply wagon on the trail, just as Garrison had said. But it was a decoy. As they approached, Vance's men opened fire from the rocks above, a perfectly executed crossfire. Panic erupted. Garrison's men of action were just frightened ranchers, not soldiers. They broke ranks and fled. Jedediah and Ben held their ground, providing covering fire. A bullet ricocheted off a rock, sending splinters into Ben's shoulder. The young deputy cried out and fell from his horse. Jedediah dragged him behind the wagon, bullets kicking up dirt all around them. He was pinned down, his deputy wounded, his posse scattered. He was outmaneuvered and utterly alone. With a desperate effort, he managed to get Ben onto Vulcan's back, and under the cover of darkness made a frantic retreat. He could hear the sound of Vance's men laughing in the hills behind them. It was a sound of absolute victory. He returned to Solitude Creek, a defeated man, his deputy bleeding, his authority shattered. The town council, swayed by Garrison's disastrous failure, now saw him as the problem. He had lost their trust. Vance had successfully isolated him. He was a marshal with no one to lead, a protector, with no one left who wanted his protection. He was truly, finally, on his own. The blizzard descended without warning, a furious, shrieking beast of wind and snow that swallowed the world in a churning vortex of white. It was the perfect cover for a serpent. Thomas Vance, the ghost of Shiloh, struck during the storm's violent peak. He knew the town would be hunkered down, that Jedediah would be tending to his wounded deputy. He knew Jedediah was alone. The news came from a terrified Dr. Albright, who burst into the marshal's office, his face as white as the snow outside. He has her, Jedediah. He came right to my back door. 2 men. They took her. The world narrowed to a single point of cold, crystalline fury. Vance had taken Naya. He had taken the last piece of Jedediah's fractured soul. A note had been left on the examination table, a single sheet of paper weighted down with a scalpel. The script was elegant mocking. The old chapel, Shadow Canyon. Come alone. It's time we finish the story you started. The chapel, a dilapidated relic from a failed settlement attempt years ago, standing alone in the valley Vance now controlled. It was a challenge, a final summons to a reckoning. Jedediah checked his Colt, the rhythmic click of the cylinder, a familiar meditative sound in the howling chaos of the storm. He pulled on his thickest sheepskin coat and wrapped a scarf over the lower half of his face. Ben Miller, his arm in a sling, tried to stand. "Marshal, you can't go alone." "I have to, Ben," Jedediah said, his voice grim. "This is my fight. It always has been." The ride to Shadow Canyon was a battle against the elements. The wind screamed, tearing at him with icy claws, and the snow was so thick he could barely see Vulcan's head in front of him. It was a blind faith navigating a world that had ceased to exist. But he rode on, guided by an internal compass of pure resolve. He found the chapel looming out of the white maelstrom like a skeletal ghost. He dismounted, the crunch of his boots swallowed by the storm's roar. He left Vulcan untethered, knowing the horse had the sense to find shelter. He drew his Colt, the cold steel a comfort in his hand, and pushed open the creaking door. The inside was a study in decay. Pews lay overturned, and snow drifted through gaps in the roof, dusting the rotting floorboards. At the far end, by the shattered remains of an altar, a single lantern cast a pool of flickering golden light. Thomas Vance stood there, silhouetted against the glow. Nia was beside him, bound to a support pillar, her face pale but defiant. Two of Vance's men stood in the shadows, rifles ready. "Welcome, Marshal Vance," said his voice, calm, almost conversational, yet it echoed in the cavernous space. "I was beginning to think the storm had claimed you. A pity. I wanted the pleasure for myself." Jedediah walked slowly down the aisle, his boots echoing on the boards. His eyes never left Vance, but his senses took in every detail: the position of the gunman, the potential cover of the overturned pews, the way the wind rattled the loose boards of the roof. "Let her go, Vance." Jedediah said, his voice low and even. "This is between you and me." Vance smiled, a sad, terrible thing. "Oh, but she is part of it now, just as my Ellen and my little Sarah were part of it." He took a step forward, his face illuminated by the lantern. The hatred in his eyes was a physical force. "Do you remember their faces, Stone? Do you ever see them in your dreams? I see them every night. I see the fire. I hear the screams. The last thing my daughter saw was the Union flag, the flag you fought for burning as it fell from the roof." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ticking pocket watch. "My wife gave this to me. It stopped at the exact moment the shell hit. 3:17 in the afternoon. I've made it my mission to know everything about the man who gave that order. Jedediah Stone, the hero who saved his men by sacrificing my family. I read how you built a new life here. A quiet life. A wife. A badge. A soul you were trying to mend. And I decided I would take it all apart, piece by piece." He gestured to Nia. "This was the masterstroke. Finding a woman your conscience couldn't ignore. Forcing you to choose between her and the town that hates her. Watching you lose everything just as I did." The wind howled outside, a mournful chorus to Vance's litany of pain. Jedediah felt the weight of his past settle on him, heavy as a shroud. "What happened that day was the tragedy of my life, Vance. But it was war. I never saw your house. I never knew. Ignorance is not innocence." Vance roared, his composure finally cracking. He raised his own revolver. "Now you will pay." As he spoke, Nia, who had been struggling against her bonds, suddenly shouted, her voice ringing with a desperate clarity that cut through the tension. He is doing it again. This land. My family were farmers here in this valley. We tended this land for generations until his men came. They drove us out, burned our home to claim the water that was ours. He is you. He is repeating the very same sin he wishes to punish. Her words struck Jedediah with the force of a revelation. He looked from Naya's impassioned face to Vance's twisted with hate. She was right. Vance, consumed by his own loss, had become the very thing he despised, a man who destroyed families, who burned homes, who valued a piece of land over human life. The cycle of violence was continuing, and Jedediah was its focal point. In that moment, he knew he had a choice. Not just to kill Vance in revenge for Nia, for the town, for the theft of his wife's locket, but to break the cycle. The gunfight exploded in a cacophony of sound and fury. Jedediah dove behind a pew as Vance's gunmen opened fire. Splinters flew as bullets tore through the decaying wood. He returned fire, his shots precise and economical. One gunman grunted and fell. The others scrambled for cover. The chapel was filled with roaring gunfire, the howl of the wind, and the ticking of Vance's pocket watch, which had fallen to the floor. Vance ignored the fight, his entire being focused on Jedediah. He advanced, firing wildly. Jedediah moved, using the shadows and the storm's chaos to his advantage. He flanked the second gunman, disarming him with a single well-aimed shot to the shoulder. Now it was just him and Vance. They faced each other in the dim, swirling snow, two men haunted by the same moment in time. Vance raised his gun for a final shot, his face a mask of suicidal despair. Jedediah was faster. His Colt bucked in his hand, and Vance's revolver went flying, clattering across the floorboards. Vance stood there unarmed, his chest heaving. "Kill me," he whispered, his voice broken. "Finish it." Jedediah walked forward and stood before the man who had tormented him. He saw not a monster, but a man shattered by grief, rebuilt by hate. To kill him now would be an act of vengeance, not justice. It would make him no better than Vance himself. He would not become another ghost haunting this valley. He lowered his Colt. "No," he said, his voice filled with a weary finality. "You're going to live with what you've done." As if on cue, the wind began to die down. The furious shrieking softened to a low moan, and through a hole in the roof, the first pale light of dawn began to filter in, illuminating the dust and snow motes dancing in the still air. The storm had broken. Jedediah cut Nia free. Her arms went around him, a desperate, trembling embrace of pure relief. He held her for a moment, the shared trauma, a silent bond between them. Then he turned his attention to the business of the law. He bound the wounded gunman and the broken man, who was Thomas Vance. He found Sarah's locket in Vance's pocket and closed his hand around the cool, familiar silver. The journey back to Solitude Creek was slow and somber. Jedediah rode at the front, leading the prisoners' horses, while Nia rode beside him. The world was pristine and white, the violence of the night washed clean by the new-fallen snow. They arrived to a town emerging from its hibernation. The townsfolk who saw the grim procession stopped and stared. Word spread quickly. When Jedediah reached the marshal's office, a crowd had gathered. Ansel Garrison stood at the front, his face a mixture of awe and shame. Deputy Miller, his arm in its sling, met them with a look of profound relief. "It's over," Jedediah said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. He dismounted and handed the reins to Ben. "This is Thomas Vance, the man responsible for the bank robbery and the attacks on your homes. He will be held for the federal circuit judge." Garrison stepped forward, his head bowed. "Marshal, we were wrong. We let fear get the better of us." Jedediah looked at him then, at the faces in the crowd. He saw not hatred, but a humbling recognition of their own weakness and a newfound, hard-won respect. Fear is a powerful thing, Ansel. But a town is only as strong as the trust it has in itself. We need to rebuild that. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The story of the showdown at the chapel became a local legend, a cautionary tale of how one man's past could threaten to destroy a community's future. Ben Miller's wounded shoulder would mend, leaving a scar he would wear with pride. The town council, led by a contrite Ansel Garrison, voted to pool their resources, offering support to the families Vance had targeted. Solitude Creek, once a town that lived up to its name, was becoming a community. One evening, Jedediah and Nia sat on the porch of the doctor's office, watching the sun set over the snow-covered peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "He is gone, but the scars remain," Nia said softly, her gaze distant. "Scars remind us we survived," Jedediah replied. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had endured so much. "We both have them." They sat in comfortable silence, two survivors bound by a shared ordeal. It wasn't a romance born of fire, but something deeper, a quiet understanding forged in the crucible of loss and redemption. Weeks later, as the first signs of a spring thaw began to soften the edges of the harsh winter, the resolution was complete. Thomas Vance was sent east under federal guard to face justice for his crimes. His cycle of revenge broken, but not excused. The town, unified by the ordeal, began to plan for its future with a renewed sense of purpose. But there was one final surprise. Nia, who had decided to stay at least for a while, approached the town council. She stood before them, not as a victim, but as a woman of immense dignity and knowledge. "You fight over the water in Shadow Canyon," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But my people knew of its true source, a hidden spring deep in the mountains that feeds the valley. We knew how to channel it without dams, using the land's own contours to build a system of irrigation that can make this entire valley bloom." She offered to share that knowledge, to bridge the gap between the settlers who had taken the land and the native people who understood it. It was an offer of peace, of a shared future, an act of grace that shamed the prejudice that had once greeted her. That afternoon, Jedediah rode out to the old chapel in Shadow Canyon. The snow was melting, and the first green shoots were pushing their way through the damp earth. He stood for a long time before the dilapidated structure, the stage of his final battle. He took Sarah's locket from his pocket. He looked at her smiling face one last time, a farewell to a ghost he had finally laid to rest. Near the chapel, where the sun hit the earth most directly, he dug a small hole with his hands. He planted a sapling he had carried with him, a young, resilient aspen. At its base, he buried the silver locket, returning that piece of his past to the earth. It was a gesture of letting go, of making peace, of embracing a future of new growth. As he stood, Nia walked up beside him. She said nothing, simply stood with him, their shoulders almost touching. They looked out over the valley, no longer a place of solitude and ghosts, but a place of promise. They were not lovers, not yet, perhaps never. They were two survivors who had faced the darkness and chosen the light, who had found a new kind of peace and purpose in a place that was at last ready to bloom.